Hello and welcome to Didn't Read It, the podcast that yearns for the great frozen north.
Books, 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 books.
I am your host, Grace Todd, and with me today is returning pal of the pod, Ty Phelps.
Hello, listeners. Thanks for having me, Grace.
Hey, buddy. How you doing?
I'm doing well, yeah. And I'm excited to talk about this book and this author today.
Yeah, so you are steering the ship
I am.
right into the iceberg.
Right into the iceberg or into the cove off the coast of Newfoundland.
Ooh, okay.
Perhaps where the smuggled rum is.
And before you seize control of the helm, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Ty Phelps. I'm a writer and musician and teacher and, and I've been on this podcast a couple of times. I talked about Ursula Le Guin. I listened and learned about the Yellow King, and it's always fun to do Didn't Read It. It's fun to do, and it's fun, I think, for people to listen to. So I appreciate you having me again.
Oh,
Yeah.
hey, that's so nice.
Well, you could cut that out for your ads or whatever, if you need to. Yeah.
The ads that we definitely have. We
That's
have
right.
many sponsors. One of them is the Great Frozen North.
I can confirm.
I scored a lucrative deal with the actual concept of frozen wastelands to try and make them seem more appealing so that people will go die in them.
Tundra is as tundra does.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they have deep pockets.
That's
turns
right.
out.
That's right. From all the gold.
The influential Tundra lobby.
They're intense. Honestly, they probably kind of are. And you know what? They became a little more intense after this author published some books about both humans and then animals in the central barrens and tundra of Canada.
All right.
That's right.
Although, objectively, the tundra could really use a lobby. Maybe then we would stop fucking with it.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Lots of bad stuff happening, kind of wherever people go, turns out. But
we're just so good at it.
it's one of our strengths. One of our tragedies.
Yay.
Woo.
Well, Ty,
okay.
tell me a story.
I'll tell
Take
you a
charge.
story. I'm gonna. So today we're talking about Never Cry Wolf, probably Farley Mowat, a Canadian author. Probably his most famous book. Came out in the early 1960s.
Okay.
And the book is interesting. It was pitched as nonfiction. It has some sort of scientific aims. Certainly, Mowat talks about. He was sent by the Canadian government, according to this book, to study wolves and understand why the caribou were dying. But it's not really a scientific book. It's a romantic book. It feels more like a memoir. It was also immediately accused of being fabricated.
Well, and I guess we're taking a position on that because this is a fiction podcast.
Yeah, so this book has been described sort of retroactively as a fictional account of an actual experience that the author had. So it is sort of based in nonfiction, but somewhat fictionalized.
Okay.
Yes. So it's it's written in first person.
Okay.
It would be kind of like autofiction, maybe we would describe it now.
Sure.
Yeah. But it's kind of right in that sort of wiggly point.
Farley Mowat walked so Ocean Vuong could run.
Sure. Yeah. And it's a really interesting book. So for a lot of reasons, and that sort of wiggly fictional bit is a big part of that. But I was thinking I'd say a little bit how I came into contact with this book. It is a pretty well-known book. It was turned into a movie in the early 80s. It was an international bestseller. It did very well, not only in Canada and the United States, but also the USSR.
Wait.
Yeah.
What?
Well, Siberia and Canada, not too dissimilar. And Mowat, who was sort of a pretty left-leaning, somewhat socialist, pretty anti-American in his views, went to the USSR a few times.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I temporarily fumbled sort of Canada versus the U. I was like, but the Cold War.
Yeah.
But
Right. We were talking Canada.
yeah.
We were in Canada.
So he was just jaunting off to the USSR being like, hey.
I mean, on occasion, and the books were well received there. In fact, one of the, not to, I guess it's not a spoiler, but this book really, the impact of it was significant because it really helped change the perception of wolves from a kind of bloodthirsty animal that maybe humans should eradicate to a cause of conservation, and in fact a popular cause of conservation. After this book came out, I mean, letter writing campaigns started to happen. Bounties were removed from a number of jurisdictions. Wolves became a kind of environmentalist cause in a way they kind of never had been before.
So there's a straight line between this book and the T-shirts that we all owned in the 90s of the wolf howling at the moon that was like airbrushed.
Yeah.
With the pine trees and everything in the background.
I think correlation causality always a little dangerous, but I would say that without this book, that's less likely.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say that. I would go so far as to say that. Yeah.
All right. Farley Mowat, the man who invented
wolf t-shirts.
The quasi-ironic wolf t-shirt.
And as a sort of short, bearded man, you know, who got a bit rotund in his later years, like you could imagine him wearing one.
Oh, sure.
And like it fits.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if the wolf shirt fits.
I mean, you're a mid-height bearded man that I know
right.
for a fact appreciates a good wolf t-shirt.
Yeah, I'm, you know, it's not in regular rotation. It's a little bit old, and it was a $3 Walgreens t-shirt that a friend bought me. Mm-hmm. But yeah, and it was really the Alec Baldwin of wolf t-shirts, those piercing blue eyes on that thing. It was really, you know, very handsome beast. Anyhow.
No, it's cool. Tell us more about how attractive the wolf on your shirt is.
Okay. We'll move on to a little bit more about Farley Mowat. So I became aware of Farley Mowat. My father read me a couple of they were called boys' books, right? And he wrote some like adventure stories now they'd be called YA or middle grade novels. Mm-hmm. And one was called The Black Joke, which is sort of like Treasure Island, but it's rum smugglers off the coast of Newfoundland.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's actually very fun. I haven't read it in ages, but I will probably revisit it at some point. And then the one I do remember more clearly was Lost in the Barrens, which is about a white kid and a Cree kid who are on like a canoeing expedition with their fathers in, you know, some part of Canada, not quite the tundra yet. And they tip, right? There's a issue on the river, and they get stranded, just the two of them. And so it's a little like Gary Paulson Hatchet, but
sure.
You know, again, way predates Hatchet. And one of the interesting things about it is, you know, you'd anticipate a boys' book from the 50s to have, you know, quite a bit of, I don't know, just problematic stuff. Mm-hmm. And there's a bit of that, and certainly by today's standards, there would be. But it's also a story, the Cree in the story are rather scared of the Inuit, right? The Inuit are viewed as sort of this other, even by the Cree. And like white people weapons had made their way sort of unevenly through the native population. So for a while the Cree had guns, the Inuit didn't. Then the Inuit get guns, and Mowat describes how this sort of tips the balance of kind of conflict. And really, there's not a ton of conflict. It's more avoidance.
Okay.
But when these two boys are lost and then they encounter an Inuit boy, mm-hmm. right, there is this, that's where this, we've been captured by like an enemy, which turns out to not be the case at all, right? And the Inuit treat them kindly, and it's one of those like, you know, don't be stupid people, like everybody's people.
Sure. The Inuit are like, why are you wandering around alone?
Right. And you're going to get snowblindness. You guys don't know what you're doing out here, right? And so there's all that kind of...
It's like, oh, look at these little idiots.
So it actually becomes a story about, right, tolerance and prejudice and all these kinds of things in a way that's, you know, somewhat progressive, especially by the standards of the day.
Now, was that based in... Was the tension between the Cree and the Inuit a real thing, or?
I don't know if that was something that he invented or something that was well established, and I don't know how much he researched. This was definitely fiction.
Right.
Right. This was like a kid's adventure book. But I remember very distinctly it as sort of a formative, you know, when I was 6 or something or 7 and my dad was reading chapters to me at night, that kind of feeling of realizing that everybody is a human being It just sort of
Sure, yeah.
It still kind of sinks in. So I've always had a soft spot for Mowat, for those childhood books. And then I was obsessed with wolves. I once turned in an unsolicited report on wolves that I had written from memory, based on a report I had written that I'd been assigned to do the year before. And so in third grade, we were assigned animal reports. And in fourth grade, I just handed my teacher one apropos of nothing.
What?
At one point. And she asked me, Tyler, what's this? And I was like, oh, it's a report on wolves. And she very graciously took it and didn't look at me like I was crazy.
What gave you this idea? Like, at what point were you like, I know what I'm going to do?
You know, I don't remember quite what motivated it, but I do remember being really taken by the whole animal report thing. And I remember trying to assign them to my family. My dad came home from work and I told him he was going to write a report on the dung beetle. And my father's a very patient man, but he said, buddy, if you want to report on the dung beetle, you're going to need to write it yourself.
This is such a born to be a writer anecdote.
Uh-huh.
You're just like, hey, I wrote this thing.
Don't you want to read it?
Don't.
Like, who wouldn't want to read
Basically,
my brilliant memorized wolf facts?
You're just pitching a story to your teacher.
Right,
Like, hey.
yeah. I got this great idea. You know, can you find me a publisher?
Your mistake was that you're never supposed to write the full story before you have an accepted pitch. This was your problem.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know how creative nonfiction worked, obviously. Anyway, so I was rather taken with Never Cry Wolf. I remember my family and I watching the movie when it came out in 1983, a sort of slightly modified and further fictionalized account, in that the character is not named Farley Mowat. Anyway, Mowat became interested in this stuff like from a very young age. There's accounts of him as a little kid trying to, start naturalist clubs. He would write little articles when he was rather young, young teenager, for these naturalist papers that, and the editor didn't read them. And so when he wrote rather graphically about the underwater mating habits of a certain duck species, and then the editor got lots of angry letters about the graphic duck stuff.
More unsolicited animal reports.
Yes. There's another anecdote in the biography I read of him as like a 10-year-old and a saleswoman coming to the door to try to sell something, and him explaining the injuries that porcupines would sometimes incur, again, while mating. So lots of sort of animal sex stories. He was born in the 1920s. He was born in 1921. In May, his parents, Angus and Helen Mowat.
Good names.
Good names. Helen Mowat, Farley's would-be sister, died right after being born. And there were a few other miscarriages, and Helen, I think, had a difficult time after that, it sounds like. And then Angus was a librarian and a bit of a philanderer.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
you don't often find those things paired together.
We've got the stereotypical sex-crazed Canadian librarian. I know it's a cliche at this point.
He had his hair up with a pencil.
That's right.
He had a pair of spectacles that he was peering over.
Yep.
Unbuttoning his cardigan suggestively.
I mean, probably, from what it sounds like.
I mean, are we in like rural small town Canada?
We were in a couple of different places. So the Mowats were in Ontario when Farley was born, and a little more urban. They moved to Saskatchewan.
Okay.
More of the outskirts. Saskatchewan is kind of western Canada, sort of above the, probably I want to say like above the Dakotas. I should have pulled up a big map of Canada if I'd try to understand all the geography. But
I'm just wondering if the women were hot to trot in part because he was a man in town who was verifiably literate.
True, yes.
Just like, ooh.
Yes.
He reads.
He has books. He has access to books. And there was irresponsible boat purchasing from time to time, and these kinds of...
Again, not things you associate with a librarian.
Yeah. So, a few other things to kind of know about Farley Mowat before we talk more about the book itself, I guess, that I think were worth exploring. So, this man's autobiography was entitled Born Naked, and he spends a lot of time with his clothes off. He is rather mischievous. He once got court-martialed when he was serving in the Canadian military during World War II. He did see combat in Italy. But just before that, he and a friend were court-martialed because they had one of those mine detectors, and they were using it in the ship, which had a bunch of metal on it, so it was going off whenever they pointed it at anything. And then they hid a few more metal slivers in certain parts of the floor and the wall of the dining room so that they could go to their commanding officer and point it at his bottom as he was playing piano and have the mine detector go off and say, "You've got a booby trap in your ass, sir." There was also a plot that was drunkenly hatched and never carried out. This was later to steal bombs from a base on the kind of border of the United States and Canada. So all just kinds of like rather wild antics.
A man after your own heart, it sounds like.
Sure, although I do like playing silly pranks on people. They don't usually involve military apparatus.
Can you confidently tell me, though, that if you were in a position where you were surrounded by military apparatus, that you would not wind up pulling pranks that
No, I cannot. I cannot say that.
Let's be real.
Yeah. Now, yes, cautious pranks. And Mowat sort of, his relationship with his dad is really interesting. He had a tense relationship with his father in some ways, a very tender relationship with his father in other ways. At one point, both of them were living together with women that were not their, in Mowat's case, he married his second wife. In Farley Mowat's case, he married his second wife, Claire, in Mexico, while he was still married to his first wife, Fran, who was in Canada. Yeah.
A little big of me, a little big of you.
And then he and his dad and both of their sort of newer women were all living together at one point. And Farley Mowat, he had kids, but then he would disappear to the Arctic for 3 weeks, or he would go to Newfoundland. He was a bit of an absentee father, for sure.
Okay.
And complicated relationships. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The women in their lives were just having the best time.
The best time. Especially his mother, Helen. Yeah. I'm going to read you something from his time in the war, because I do think it has some... I think this illuminates his relationship with his dad.
Ooh, okay.
In interesting ways. And Angus had served in the First World War. This is what Farley Mowat's father wrote to him after Farley saw combat. "And I can say this to you, my brother, that the moment of elation at being a part of a group of fighting men, which goes deeper than any man could express, and that feeling of oneness with the finest of mankind will live with you forever, to your death, and, I have some hope, beyond. Of course, life being what it is, some letdown will follow, and there will be moments of bitterness and disillusion and resentment, but beneath it all, nothing can ever take that moment of insight and understanding from you, and this is a gift reserved for the infantrymen."
As someone who has read a lot of World War I literature, that is an almost anomalously rosy view of what combat...
The nobleness is like, it still has that sort of almost...
Do we know what his dad actually did in the war?
I would have to dig more deeply. I don't have it at the top of my head.
Because I'm not going to lie, that reeks of somebody who went over and didn't spend a lot of time in,
The trenches.
With their feet rotting off.
Yeah, being gassed. Yeah. Well, so this is how Farley sort of responds in his journal. "I'm becoming more than ever determined to do the hermit stunt après la guerre, having overcome my fear that a corrosive bitterness might be my heritage from the war. I know my point of view has changed dramatically from the dewy-eyed visions of earlier years, but I don't think the way I see things now is necessarily all bad. Caution, suspicion, and selective intolerance are not evil of themselves, as long as they are not directed at the true beliefs and honest actions of others. A blindly benevolent love-thy-neighbor attitude, as prescribed in the best circles, is too much like living on a surfeit of sugar plums." So he's got a much more kind of suspicious, embittered...
But also nuanced
view of what kind of combat did. It took him a long time to kind of get back to things. And one of the things that tended to help him was writing and then kind of disappearing into what he would call the land of the others. and the others are the animal world.
Sure.
Yeah.
Not the only man who came out of World War II being like, you know what sounds great? Being alone in nature indefinitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or World War I. Not the only man to come out of a war full stop being like, I don't know, man. I'm just going to go hang out with some bears, some elk. I'm going to stare into the frozen wastes and feel my solitude.
Yeah. I don't know. You do get this more nuanced view of things, and you get this kind of pretty frustrated with humanity, slightly misanthropic, but fairly celebratory of like the natural world and things like that. Kind of coming out of in part that experience and just sort of the growing up in Canada in the 20s and 30s, right? There's probably a lot of very fascinating wildlife and stuff not too far.
Yeah.
Out the back door.
I mean, a lot of North America writ large was a lot more wild then.
Oh, yeah.
In ways that I think we kind of forget sometimes at scale.
So, he was dealing with some mental health issues. His first wife suffered from pretty crippling depression at times. They had some real difficulties. But he became a very successful writer, and he became a successful writer right away. So his first book...
Must be nice.
Gah. Now, neither of us have written a first book yet, so it's still possible for us.
This is true.
Yeah. But his first book was called People of the Deer, about a small group of Inuit in central Canada, in the Barrens. Mowat spent time with this group in 1947. In the book, it's mostly just him, but he was there with other people, another naturalist who he really didn't get along with. But this small group had been really decimated by the encroachment of European colonization. In particular, it was dealt with at different times with starvation, really dwindling population. At a certain point, there were only 80 or so members of this band left.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. And he wrote this book, The People of the Deer. And the deer, in these parts of Canada, the deer just mean caribou.
Okay.
Right? So anytime deer is mentioned, it's caribou. The book was immediately really controversial. People were accusing him that he had made this group up. That this band didn't exist, that no one had ever encountered them, they weren't part of any of these official records, and so it was actually debated in the House of Commons in Canada in the early 50s.
Did they exist?
They did. He was eventually proven right about a lot of this stuff. But...
Wait, did Canada then go steaming in and take all of their children and put them in residential schools?
There were different relocations.
Oh, God, am I right? Oh, no!
And then eventually an apology by the government, rather long after the fact. But this book really brought a lot of attention to the way the Canadian government was treating the native populations in Canada, right? And they have as spotty a record as anybody else. So again, it's this sort of very interesting, here's a white guy and a World War II vet white guy, right?
Sure.
Who's got not super enlightened views on women and, I think in some ways was one of those people who was probably doing his best, but back then your best really wasn't very good compared to today's standards and all these kinds of things. And yet a couple of different times he writes books that are, for all their flaws, especially if you view them as nonfiction, right? They are not scientific, rigorous, source-cited. They are memoir-y, flowery, fictionalized accounts of real events.
But those are also what sells.
They are what sell, and they are what stir public reaction. And so, some of the insufficient progress that's been made around trying to make some amends to the natural world and to native populations, Farley Mowat's books drove a lot of that conversation early on, and they became really controversial because a lot of people didn't like what he was saying. So I just find it kind of interesting that, here's this guy who's sort of seems to want to be left alone in the woods, and he keeps getting caught up in these.
Well, it kind of seems like he's inserting himself into these things.
Oh, yeah.
By virtue of writing a book about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. If you write a book about it, you can't get mad if people read the book and have reactions to it.
Yeah, that's pretty inevitable.
It's kind of what you want.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah, you want people to read and You hope for good reactions, but
You have to stand behind the things you said at a certain point.
that's right. Which he does, but in an interesting way. This is the way the biographer introduces his subject, Farley
Okay.
Mowat. On January 6th, 1999, a reader wrote to the Globe and Mail, "When will you finally move Farley Mowat and his 1997 nonfiction book, The Farfarers, into the fiction column of the National Bestsellers list? After all, everyone in Canada knows that Farley Mowat is himself a purely fictional character."
What?
Years after the fact, Farley is convinced that his adoption of a public persona, the outspoken and more than a trifle exhibitionist young man, was really the brainchild of his publisher and close friend Jack McClelland. "I think we were having one of our liquid lunches, and as we reeled back toward the office, Jack said, 'You have to present an image.' So I listened and I worked out my image. A kilt-wearing, swaggering, mooning, drinking Farley Mowat. It was always a cardboard cutout, and it was very useful. I could carry it in front of me and be my own self behind it, but I don't need it anymore. The cutout may be cardboard, but Farley still wears it when it suits him and when he needs it. I like a good fight if there's a good reason for doing it," he admits, and adds, "I'll break my ass to save whales or do something for people in distress." When the writer and broadcaster Peter Guzowski interviewed him at the Harborfront International Festival of Authors in 1999 and debated with him about the number of facts a nonfiction writer owed his readers, Farley bellowed, "F the facts."
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, that's a thing that happens a lot.
Mm-hmm.
If you are going to lead a public life, a lot of people settle into like a public persona. That's also a thing that I associate very heavily with that generation of writers in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Like both of the post-war generations of especially male writers
Mm-hmm.
went very far out of their way to cultivate these very combative, larger than life, sort of manly man personas,
Mm-hmm.
which makes I wonder sometimes if they felt like they were in kind of an arms race with the studio system in Hollywood that was so efficient at churning out those personas for actors.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were like, well,
I think so, and I think, and then you have the influence of the generation of at least American writers right before, right? Faulkner, Hemingway, right?
that's right.
Yeah, I think some of it's self-protection, right? You can sort of feel like you're doing what you need to do to make your living without revealing who you really are, and some of it's, I think, also, I don't know, this strange desire to the distinction between truth and facts,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is like the sort of thing that I think like poets, when they've had too much to drink, might argue about, right? And I'm empathetic to that perspective, but I also think there's a contract with the reader, I think.
Yeah.
And presenting a piece as either fictional or non-fictional helps the reader understand what kind of contract they're getting into, which is why I really get frustrated with the based on a true story language, right? Because that's sort of deliberately blurring these lines.
Well,
And they're already blurry.
And because we are living in the wreckage of that contract breaking down, right? I mean, you look at God, there are so many nonfiction, in scare quotes, books out there by especially political talking heads that are full of untruths.
Mm-hmm.
To use a very easy one, there's so much shit in Vance's Hillbilly Elegy that is so obviously made up or embroidered for effect.
Mm-hmm.
There are anecdotes in there that are just on their face, too stupid to be real, essentially. That's a nonfiction book.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh, it's very frustrating.
It is. Yeah. And I think especially because it also, so fiction, if fiction isn't real, then it's not as valuable. And it's no, it's a really, really excellent vehicle for exploring humans. Maybe the best vehicle we have.
Yeah, storytelling is kind of what we do.
It's kind of what we do, and it's kind of at our most basic level. When I teach narrative theory classes, and I promise we won't get in the weeds here, I tell my students, I'm like, one of the things I think is that story is the building block of thought itself. Organizing something into a meaningful shape that has a cause and effect structure, you need that to do any kind of thinking.
Yeah.
right?
Fair enough.
That's how we create a sense of identity, a sense of, at the collective level, a sense of culture, right? It's how we decide if what kind of day we're having. It's how we come up with things like logic and math, even though those are sort of divorced. Once we figure out how to talk about them, they're divorced from maybe our observed life experience, right? They exist in a slightly different level. But the way we talk about those things and communicate those things is all through metaphor and story and things like that. So
Sure.
Without it, I don't think we have anything human.
Yeah.
So,
and that is why this is a call-out episode. We are reclassifying his work as fiction. Shots fired. We're taking a stand.
I mean, yeah, fuck the facts, Farley. You said it.
The
right?
facts, you're a fiction book now. Ha ha!
That's right. It does say the amazing true story of life among Arctic wolves. And then Wikipedia says a fictional account. Right. So we're very much in that autofiction blurry realm.
Joke's on you, Mowat. You're a novelist
You're a
now.
Well, and all of his best and most celebrated books were either fictionalized nonfiction or straight up YA or novels.
Yeah.
When he tried to do other stuff is when his publishers would get annoyed. And his writing, I think, lends itself to that. He has a lot of sort of dramatic flair. And I'll talk about a few of the scenes in Never Cry Wolf. And I think we'll kind of pivot now into this book in particular, now that we have a little bit of author background and also a bunch of fiction or nonfiction percolating thoughts.
All right.
All right. So this takes place in the late 40s.
Okay.
And Farley Mowat, the character, after a brief sort of introduction to how he became interested in wilderness, the animal world, things like that, gets sent. He's working for the government, and he gets sent to study wolves because there is concern about the caribou population. It is sort of the expectation of the field office, according to Farley, the character, that it is wolves in the tundra that are responsible for the population decline in the caribou. And it's this sort of very comical, bumbling journey where, he gets to a remote place called Churchill, and then he has to find a pilot who's supposed to take him to certain coordinates. And he kind of gets close to where he's supposed to be, but it winds up, they kind of see a cabin, and so he gets dropped off at this cabin.
It's the wrong cabin.
Well, there's not many cabins out there. There's not much of anything human. But it's a cabin by a man, half white, half Inuit man named Mike in the story. And Mike finds him pretty bizarre. A lot of the book is Farley Mowat, the character, doing things that the people around him, almost entirely Inuit, or in Mike's case, half Inuit, find just completely, what are you doing?
Classic fish out of water.
And these are things like, he sets up his base camp. He's brought a bunch of what he calls wolf juice, which is a mixture of the alcohol that he's supposed to be using for preserving samples, but that he switches with formaldehyde because he can then use this to mix with this beer that he buys. And
Ew.
They call it wolf juice.
How very fraternity-y.
Yes. Now, granted, there's like nothing else. He's got like some rations and a rifle and, like stuff to make
Sure,
a camp.
but like, can't you just drink the beer and then take shots of the liquor?
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound better?
Of course it sounds better. But then you couldn't call it wolf juice.
I think you could. No one would stop you.
That's true. And
You could just call the beer wolf juice and nobody would stop you.
And who knows if this is even true, right? The facts.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So Mike finds him very bizarre, and he slowly starts to make contact with the wolves. First, before Mike even gets there, and he's sort of in the cabin not knowing what's going on, he thinks he encounters a wolf, and it turns out to be one of Mike's sled dogs.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
Right. And so a few of the interesting moments include the initial contact with the animals. There's a moment where he realizes that the wolves, because he hasn't seen them hunting caribou yet, and he doesn't see caribou around, and the wolves, once they kind of get used to him, pretty much ignore him. And even early on, they kind of just leave him be. And so he's like, where are these bloodthirsty killers that I'm supposed to be watching? And they're not doing anything to caribou right now. I haven't even seen caribou yet.
Then what are they eating?
So what are they eating? And so he finally is watching one of them and realizes that he thinks they're eating mice, and that perhaps mice during at least some of the year are composing a large part of their diet. Again, this is sort of like, he's like kind of a scientist, but not really. So he's like, well, how do I do a control to understand if mice are enough nutritionally for a large carnivorous animal to live on? And so he decides he's going to eat mice, nothing but mice, for like a while. And so there's this whole there's even a mouse recipe in the book.
I'm trying to figure out like what this makes me like. I've read this book, not this book, but I've read this template of a book. I'm just a bumbling guy who's been sent to accomplish a task, and I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm just gonna figure it out as I go. And like, I don't know, I just feel like it's such a this is like a formula now. Like, these books are incredibly popular, or at least were 10 years ago. Nonfiction books by white guys that were like, isn't it funny that I have no idea what I'm doing?
Yeah, I do think it's a genre, and I think like it's one of the ways that an author, especially if it's a nonfiction book, tries to get the reader on their side.
Sure.
Right? By presenting themselves in a sort of self-deprecating way. And in the case of this book, I'm fairly convinced that some of it's performance, and that's the enhancement and the fictionalization, and some of it is fairly genuine, depending on what we think actually is factually true or not.
And how much of a sitcom husband we really think Farley Mowat is at the end of the day.
Touché. So, I'm going to read you the first encounter with the wolf.
Ooh.
My head came slowly over the crest, and there was my quarry. He was lying down, evidently resting after his mournful sing-song, and his nose was about 6 feet from mine. We stared at one another in silence. I do not know what went on in his massive skull, but my head was full of the most disturbing thoughts. I was peering straight into the amber gaze of a fully grown Arctic wolf who probably weighed more than I did, and who was certainly a lot better versed in close combat techniques than I would ever be. For some seconds, neither of us moved, but continued to stare hypnotically into one another's eyes. The wolf was the first to break the spell. With a spring that would have done justice to a Russian dancer, he leaped about a yard straight into the air and came down running. The textbooks say a wolf can run 25 miles an hour, but this one did not appear to be running so much as flying low. Within seconds he had vanished from my sight. My own reaction was not so dramatic, although I may very well have set some sort of record for a cross-country traverse myself. My return over the river was accomplished with such verve that I paddled the canoe almost her full length up on the beach on the other side. Then, remembering my responsibilities to my scientific supplies, I entered the cabin, barred the door, and regardless of the discomfort caused by the stench of the debris on the floor, made myself as comfortable as I could on top of the table for the balance of the short-lived night. It had been a strenuous interlude, but I could congratulate myself that I had, at last, established contact, no matter how briefly, with the study species. So, again, right, this is very, like, 6 feet away, hypnotic gaze.
Sure.
It's like a wolf meet cute.
Yeah.
Kind of. And that's one of the reasons why I think the book did have such an impact on the general public around changing the reputation of the animal, is because Mowat sort of romanticizes and anthropomorphizes them. He names them all in the book. George, Angeline, Uncle Albert. He describes their personalities. They become really like characters. You know, how they treat the pups, the way they take the pups on a caribou hunt when the caribou eventually do come.
No.
Yeah.
This all feels very standard now. Like this, none of this feels out of the ordinary for what we've kind of come to expect. Was it new then? Was this unusual?
Yeah, so I think, so one of the things that makes it complicated, right, is because much like People of the Deer became controversial, this book also was met with Some people in the agency were like, you were basing your work off of work that was already done. Other people were like, you were there, but you weren't there as long as you said you were there, and you weren't there by yourself. Other people were like, this isn't scientific. So there was this back and forth about kind of the reaction to it. So here's what some different people have said about the impact of this book. The deluge of letters received by the Canadian Wildlife Service from concerned citizens opposing the killing of wolves testifies to the growing significance of literature as a protest medium. Modern Canadians roused to defend a species that their predecessors sought to eradicate. By the 1960s, the wolf had made the transition from the beast of waste and desolation to conservationist cause célèbre. Never Cry Wolf played a key role in fostering that change. So that's one person who sees some real value in it. Mm-hmm. One article published in Canadian Field Naturalist compared this to Little Red Riding Hood, saying that I hope the readers of Never Cry Wolf will realize that both stories have about the same factual content. Comparing Never Cry Wolf to Little Red Riding Hood. Right? As for the authenticity of his wolf story, he virtually abandoned his wolf den observations after less than 4 weeks, said John Goddard, to which Mowat excoriated and said, bullshit, pure and simple. The guy's got as many facts wrong as there are flies on a toad. That's roadkill.
Oh dear.
So there was some, again.
So how long was he there? Do we know? Does anyone know? I guess there's really no way to verify it.
No.
Because he was in the middle of nowhere.
He was in the middle of nowhere, and it was the 40s.
Sure.
It was the late 40s, so there wasn't like...
We can't pull up the cell phone records.
No, there was no real way to track it. We don't really know what he did.
Plot twist, he never went at all.
I'm pretty sure he went. I don't know how long he stayed or how rigorously he conducted his research, right? One of the things that has kind of stood is that, again, this is not scientific literature. This is sort of a fictionalized piece of nonfiction, but a lot of the wolf behavior he describes and the sort of social hierarchy and the social structure and how it's mostly just like a pretty functional enclave, and other wolves sort of sometimes drift in or out of it, and there doesn't seem to be huge territorial disputes because after all this is the Barrens in Canada and there's plenty of room, has basically held up. A lot of it's been refined, right? A lot more significant and actually scientific observation has come out of it. But it reminds me, honestly, I think of this book in a lot of the way I think of like Bowling for Columbine, if you remember that Michael Moore movie.
Oh my God. I haven't thought about that in years.
Which is basically propaganda. Like he distorts a number of things in there rather significantly. Now, I am empathetic to the cause behind that distortion, and so I am perhaps liable to be a little more forgiving towards said distortion than I would were the politics of it different.
Sure.
Right? And it's the same with this, where like,
well,
I'm glad we've tried to be more attentive to wolf conservation. And I mean, I was the kid. I used to get in arguments with people about fairy tales. I basically boycotted fairy tales from like 3rd grade through 9th grade. Because of the way they portrayed wolves. I was like, if you brought up the 3 Little Pigs, you're in for a young Ty Phelps lecture.
That is such a, like, there's just something about that is so relentlessly 1990s.
I am a child of my generation.
Just, actually, if you pay attention, the Brothers Grimm are clearly anti-wolf propagandists.
Yep. Yeah, that's what I would say. Basically, yes.
Well, so
yeah,
you make a good point, especially in terms of, I think one of the reasons we have to be so careful is because it is so easy to forgive the sort of manipulation of
100%.
Information when it's something you agree with.
100%. It's we notice it all the time, and the internet's made it so.
And again,
like we all participated in these weird ways.
And this is one of the things that drives me nuts. It's just like, this is what fiction is for. Just write a fictional book, because then there's an implied narrator, and you still have to stand behind the things that you say. You have to stand behind the world that you create. But like, this is why we write fictional books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's very interesting, the sort of audience bias toward nonfiction. and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but
Yeah, you are.
that's like a really, it just, for whatever reason, so many people seem to respond better to something if there's that, it was true, or it was based on a true story. Like, that's a marketing decision, I think, more than anything else. And I think we are seeing it in the sort of explosion of memoir and autofiction, right?
Yeah.
As sort of a viable kind of trend in the last little bit.
I think there is a cultural perception that is recent-ish. I don't think it has always been this way, but I think there is a cultural perception that fiction reading is the junk food to nonfiction's health food, and that nonfiction reading is inherently more virtuous and better for you. And I think that really appeals to especially America's like under-acknowledged sort of Calvinist streak.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Wherein all pleasure is inherently suspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people don't even realize how much they think of nonfiction as healthier and more virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. I
No,
mean,
it
A of all, it's not. But B of all, I think fiction is actually a lot more important for us as just like people.
I think reading fiction can help you understand your values and what you care about and how you think of the world in a way that is harder for nonfiction to do.
Yeah.
And it's because, right, it's about seeing three-dimensional characters being pushed, right? That it sort of makes us want to understand how they made those decisions. It makes us think about how we would make decisions. It makes us think about like what we care about and what our limits are. And if we read widely, we can start to see and ask those questions about ourselves in all sorts of situations that we might not be able to ever really find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Right? That's a really exciting and entertaining and engaging experience. And it's funny to me that if nonfiction is the healthy version, why do we belabor kids in high school English class with Of Mice and Men and Shakespeare? And,
Well, we don't anymore.
Well, we don't anymore.
But, right? I mean, that's one of the big things that has happened in our lifetimes is that schools are no longer, a lot of schools, I shouldn't say this unilaterally, but a lot of schools are no longer requiring students to read whole novels. They are
Right.
having them read excerpts
Mm-hmm.
and analyze
texts.
excerpts, but they're not reading whole literary works of fiction.
Mm-hmm. We've like given up on developing the attention span.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really worries me about the sort of mass pivot to nonfiction is that I think nonfiction has a way of obscuring authorial intent and authorial agenda in a way that is, I think, a lot more insidious than in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you are reading fiction, you are more aware of the author. You are more aware of the idea that this is a story that someone has created.
Shaped.
And so
Yep.
when you bump up against something that you disagree with or that rubs you the wrong way, you're more likely to say kind of to yourself, like, okay, why is this story going this way? Why is this character making this decision? This isn't the decision I would make. And sometimes you can read a story, and I've had this happen. I've had this happen recently with contemporary fiction. I read a work by an author, a very famous, very successful author. I read one of her works and was like, okay. Then I read another one of her works and was like, oh, this person's worldview is like fundamentally too cynical for me, which is really saying something.
Yeah, that would be pretty cynical.
Because I am
You're not a shrinking violet when it comes to cynicism.
I am frequently accused of being downright hopeless in my understanding of the world. And I was like, this person's sort of idea of like what humans are and what humans mean is like too angry even for me. And I'm just gonna like, I don't know. I don't agree with what she's trying to put across here. It doesn't mean that her work isn't interesting or worth interrogating, but like you get 2 books in and you're like, oh, I see what you're doing. Like, I see what the project of this is. And I think with nonfiction, people are more likely to bump up against something that they're uncomfortable with or confused by or that just doesn't gel with the way that they understand the world. And they're more likely to just go, well, I must be wrong because this is nonfiction and someone put it in a book And if it's in a book on a shelf that I can buy at like Barnes and Noble, then somebody must have vetted these facts.
Mm-hmm.
So
Nonfiction, it doesn't feel as shaped, right? It doesn't feel as authorially shaped. Like we imagine more the author is just sort of objectively recounting. And that's just not, even scholarly nonfiction is shaped and biased, and and hopefully there's some checks and balances to mitigate those things. But yeah, so the fiction nonfiction thing becomes pretty interesting. And insofar as there's an arc or a plot to this book, it is Mowat's growing understanding of how wolves actually are versus how human beings, at least Western, white Canadians, view them.
Sure. Dumpling contributing to the wolf discourse.
She is. Well, near and dear to her heart. So there's a moment where he gets really frustrated somewhat early on with his interaction. He winds up pointing his rifle at them, at the wolves. But there's sand in it, and so it doesn't fire, which is ultimately a good thing. And so he talks about this. I was in no fit mental state to do anything except hurry home to Mike's and seek solace for my tattered nerves and frayed vanity in the bottom of a jar of wolf juice. I had a long and salutary session with the stuff that night, and as my spiritual bruises became less painful under its healing influence, I reviewed the incidents of the past few days. Inescapably, the realization was being borne in upon my preconditioned mind that the centuries-old and universally accepted human concept of wolf character was a palpable lie. On 3 separate occasions in less than a week, I had been completely at the mercy of these, quote, savage killers. But far from attempting to tear me limb from limb, they had displayed a restraint verging on contempt, even when I invaded their home and appeared to be posing a direct threat to the young pups. This much was obvious, yet I was still strangely reluctant to let the myth go down the drain. Part of this reluctance was no doubt due to the thought that by discarding the accepted concepts of wolf nature, I would be committing scientific treason, to the knowledge that recognition of the truth would deprive my mission of its fine aura of danger and high adventure, and not the least part of that reluctance was probably due to my unwillingness to accept the fact that I had been made to look like a blithering idiot, not by my fellow man, but by mere brute beasts. Nevertheless, I persevered. When I emerged from my session with the wolf juice the following morning, I was somewhat the worse for wear in a physical sense, but I was cleansed and purified spiritually. Wolf juice. I had wrestled with my devils and I had won. I had made the decision that from this hour onward I would go open-minded into the lupine world and learn to see and know the wolves, not for what they were supposed to be, but for what they actually were. Now then, of course, he goes on to describe them in basically human terms. Naming, right, which
sure.
you get because we're humans and that's how we would understand things.
It's interesting, though, because one of the things that strikes me is it sounds like the sheer perniciousness of the idea, the cultural idea of wolves that he is overturning is in itself a weirdly anthropomorphic understanding. It's not just like, oh, these are carnivores doing what carnivores do. It's a narrativized anthropomorphic idea of the unrepentant, violent, kills for the sake of killing. Yeah. Which is itself, that is, yeah.
Well, and so gradually, the more observing he does, his understanding sort of from that point forward really begins to change. He also meets a couple of Inuit men. The primary character, other than Mike, is Utek. And Utek winds up really teaching character Farley a lot. Like, Utek can kind of tell, based on what the wolf howls are, what's going on. And so he'll disappear, and then 4 days later will return with, like, a group of his family that have been traveling. And Mowat's like, well, how did you know? And he's like, because I told you that howl from over there sounded like howls I've heard in the past that indicate, like, people. And since if there's anyone around here, they're probably somebody I know because there's, like, nobody, right? And, it's I would describe it as somewhat paternalistic still, right? It is
Sure.
still a white person in the 1960s.
The
writing
magical,
about this.
mystical native man.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's a little much, but he does talk about Utek as a real friend and a source of real knowledge, basically sort of like a very good naturalist, even though obviously from a very different tradition. So again, kind of an interesting mix. He couldn't seem to help but sort of romanticize stuff.
Sure.
And it's Utek who really talks to him and teaches him about this idea of, which has sort of been accepted in common knowledge for predator-prey homeostasis ever for ages, but you don't watch the wolves kill a whole bunch of caribou because, A, killing a caribou is hard,
Yeah.
even for a pack of wolves, right? They're large and fast, and they're in big herds, right? And so who can they actually get? It's usually the old or the sick, sometimes a calf that strays away, right? Sometimes an isolated other member, but it's almost always a weaker member of the herd. So the wolves keep the caribou strong because they're kind of trimming away the weaker members of the caribou herd. That's something that Utek talks about. And this is the reason why when the caribou finally do come, they seem to mostly ignore the wolves. The wolves
Yeah.
will kind of maybe test a little band, but if nothing kind of shakes loose, then because they're not going to expend a bunch of energy tearing after every single
Sure.
caribou, right? And one kill will last for a long time. So the hunt stuff and that sort of symbiotic predator-prey relationship gets sort of filtered in. And then we learn that, well, who's been killing the caribou? Of course, it's white people. It's sport hunters. It's people,
Of course.
And he writes,
Of course.
and this is something that's recurred in a number of his books. When he was living in Newfoundland, he tried to stop a big group of people from basically just doing target practice on a whale that had wound up in this cove and couldn't seem to get back out.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and then he wound up administering to the whale until it died, and then published something in a national newspaper about it, and
What is wrong with us?
drove all this stuff. So anyway, the climax of the story is him going into the den.
That is a terrible idea.
Right?
This part's definitely fiction, right? I feel like he would have been eaten.
So the one thing I will say is there is a wonderful documentary called White Wolf, and it was made in the 80s. It's National Geographic. I have it on DVD, although they never really marketed it as a DVD. But I eventually tracked down what had been the VHS, and I contacted National Geographic, and what they do is they burn them to order. And so it's an unlabeled DVD. There's no menu. You put it in, and it starts playing. And these are Arctic wolves on Ellesmere Island. And they had not ever really been... Nobody lives on Ellesmere Island. It's polar bears and musk oxen and Arctic hares and wolves. It's in the Arctic Circle. So a wildlife biologist named David Mensch, I believe his name is, or maybe Mech, and then Jim Brandenburg, a photographer, went to study the wolves out there. And there is footage of them going into the den after they've established some trust. Like, they don't know. They haven't been hunted, right? Like,
Sure.
there's barely any contact.
Fair enough.
So it has happened.
Do not do this at home,
No, and I don't know if he did this.
but someone has.
Yeah.
Okay, fair.
I was beginning to suffer from claustrophobia, for the tunnel was just big enough to admit me. At the 8-foot mark, the tunnel took a sharp upward bend and swung to the left. I pointed the torch in the new direction and pressed the switch. 4 green lights in the murk ahead reflected back the dim torch beam. In this case, green was not my signal to advance. I froze where I was while my startled brain tried to digest the information that at least 2 wolves were with me in the den. Despite my close familiarity with the wolf family, this was the kind of situation where irrational but deeply ingrained prejudices completely overmaster reason and experience. To be honest, I was so frightened that paralysis gripped me. I had no weapon of any sort, and in my awkward posture I could barely have gotten one hand free with which to ward off an attack. It seemed inevitable that the wolves would attack me, for even a gopher will make a fierce defense when he is cornered in his den. The wolves did not even growl. Save for the 2 faintly glowing pairs of eyes, they might not have been there at all. The paralysis began to ease, and though it was a cold day, sweat broke out all over my body. In a fit of blind bravado, I shoved the torch forward as far as my arm would reach. It gave just sufficient light for me to recognize Angeline, the mother wolf, and one of the pups. They were scrunched hard against the back wall of the den, and they were as motionless as death. The shock was wearing off by this time, and the instinct for self-preservation was regaining command. As quickly as I could, I began wiggling back up the slanting tunnel, tense with the expectation that at any instant the wolves would charge. But by the time I had reached the entrance and had scrambled well clear of it, I still had not heard nor seen the slightest sign of movement from the wolves. I sat down on a stone and shakily lit a cigarette, becoming aware as I did that I was no longer frightened. Instead, an irrational rage possessed me. If I had had my rifle, I believe I might have reacted in brute fury and tried to kill them both.
What?
The cigarette burned down, and a wind began to blow out of the somber northern skies. I began to shiver again, this time from cold instead of rage. My anger was passing, and I was limp in the aftermath. Mine had been the fury of resentment born of fear. Resentment against the beasts who had engendered naked terror in me, and who by so doing had intolerably affronted my human ego. I was appalled at the realization of how easily I had forgotten and how readily I had denied all the summer sojourn with the wolves had taught me about them and about myself. I thought of Angeline and her pup cowering at the bottom of the den where they had taken refuge from the thundering apparition of the aircraft, and I was shamed. Somewhere to the eastward, a wolf howled lightly, questioningly. I knew the voice, for I had heard it many times before. It was George, sounding the wasteland for an echo from the missing members of his family. But for me it was a voice which spoke of the lost world which once was ours before we chose the alien role, or a world which I had glimpsed and almost entered, only to be excluded at the end by my own self. And that is how the book ends.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's I think we don't think enough about how much of our world is governed by people who react with bloodthirsty rage when their egos are threatened even the tiniest amount.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know if that's fictional or not, and I don't know if it's exaggerated moods or what I like about the ending. It does feel very honest.
Yeah.
That, like,
he's getting to some truths here.
I went through this experience, and even after all this stuff that I'd learned and all this time I'd spent, I was still terrified at this close connection with this otherness.
Mm-hmm.
And I reacted out of fear, and then right after that fear, I reacted out of anger. Thank goodness I didn't have implements to make use of that anger.
Yeah.
Right? But then, only after I'm able to calm down do I realize that, no, this is actually, they were fine.
I'm the problem.
All of this was just me projecting onto wolfdom.
All of this was just me projecting onto nature all along.
Mm-hmm. But that same projection is what made the book successful.
Sure.
Because that's the way that people connected enough with what had been a kind of adversarial animal culturally to decide to value their lives in a different way.
Well, that's kind of what I meant. Is like it's all humans projecting themselves onto nature.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is humans projecting themselves onto nature.
Yep.
We can't help it.
We can't seem to help it. That's the storytelling impulse, right? That's how we make sense of things, for better or worse.
Now, how would you relate his work to that of Jack London?
Ooh, great question.
Because that's another guy who pretty notorious, like very into nature, very into liked dogs better than wolves, but like
yes.
generally wrote about men projecting themselves onto nature, but also did that himself.
Yeah. I've always connected with Mowat's work a little bit more than Jack London's, because Jack London's feels a little bit more in the sort of dominating tradition. Yes, it's maybe men out alone, but they're sort of like conquering something or surviving in this.
Yeah, but like a lot of them die horrifically.
Adversarial way. And Mowat's writing about nature feels like a blend of like Jack London and maybe like Thoreau, where it's a little more empathetic, a little more invested in like figuring out this other thing and learning, even if it is still projected and then embellished and sold, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, it's a clear overlap. I mean, I think of, was it White Fang?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I was thinking of that. I think it's, was it To Light a Fire?
Mm-hmm.
The short story?
Yeah.
That one where the dude just gets murked at the end.
Yep. I think I wound up teaching that story one time in like one of those very obvious man versus nature conflict demonstrations, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, like, yes, similar traditions, I think, but Mowat's interpretation feels a little more in the environmentalist
Sure.
tradition.
Well, partly I'm just wondering how much Mowat is intentionally evoking or toying with London's legacy, because Jack London was writing much earlier.
Yes.
Like Mowat would have grown up reading Jack London, almost certainly.
Yeah. It was not mentioned in any of the things that I looked into, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because it's not like Farley Mowat has a million. He wrote like almost 40 books.
Damn.
The biographer, perhaps biased, said something about being Canada's most celebrated writer. I think Margaret Atwood would have something to say about that. I think, yes, she is now disgraced, but Alice Munro would probably have something to say about that. And I think he was always a little more popular in Canada than he was in the U.S., but his books were reviewed very well in the U.S. Like the New York Times wrote good reviews of People of the Deer, for example, and it won a prize in the U.S.
I mean, it was certainly a good era, right?
Yeah.
The 60s through the 90s. I mean, that was a big moment in time for reconnecting with nature. And
Oh yeah, I mean, you had Rachel Carson, you had a lot of the poetry of the era, right? Mary Oliver, stuff like that. It's kind of has that angle. William Stafford, you've got
Captain Planet.
Yeah, you've got Captain Planet. You've got, the whole sort of kind of rise of like green marketing, right? All those kinds of things. And it, for all the value of them, and it's not like there's no value, that's also hard to separate from like the market forces that drive them and the way that like we keep coming up with shit that's like isn't going to help. Like why? Like we don't need AI to figure this out. Like, and it's just going to take more energy. So could we just maybe not? Nobody asked for it.
But
yeah.
It is a good reminder how recent a lot of this stuff is, especially now that we are coming around full circle and they are trying to remove a lot of the legal protections for wolves, as an example. I think there's a whole generation of younger people out there who, for their entire lives, it's just been like, wolves are good, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that we could go back to mass slaughtering predatory animals for the convenience of ranchers feels unlikely.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, we haven't. We only came around on this very recently. It has not been very long.
It wasn't long ago. And all it takes is one stupid, I think about like when the Supreme Court was like, what's worked so well? These elements of the Voting Rights Act and, different things from the civil rights era. They've worked so well that they've kind of solved the problem. So let's get rid of them.
That's my...
Like, no. If it's working really well, maybe we should leave it alone.
Women have so many rights that we should just take some of them away again.
Right? Wouldn't that be great? And then, like, immediately you saw voter ID laws in a bunch of Republican-led states. This was, 2014 or something, when they repealed something from the Voting Rights Act. And it was just like...
What a horrific time to be alive.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's basically, right? I know we didn't talk a whole lot of, like, this book doesn't... He's just out in the middle of nowhere with almost no other people. And with some wolves, there is a very funny scene where he thinks something exciting is happening. And he's been, like, sunbathing. So he goes tearing across the tundra with nothing but his boots on and his rifle. And he's then chased by a group of Inuit that he doesn't know. Because I'll read it. I gave it up then and turned for home. When I was still some miles from camp, I saw several figures running toward me, and I recognized them as the Inuit woman and her 3 youngsters. They seemed to be fearfully distrayed about something. They were all screaming, and the woman was waving a 2-foot-long snow knife while her 3 offspring were brandishing deer spears and skinning knives. I stopped in some perplexity. For the first time, I became uncomfortably aware of my condition. Not only was I unarmed, but I was stark naked. I was in no condition to ward off an attack, and one seemed imminent, although I had not the slightest idea what had roused the Inuit to such a mad endeavor. Discretion seemed the better part of valor, so I stretched my weary muscles and sprinted hard to bypass them. I succeeded, but they were still game, and the chase continued most of the way back to camp, where I scrambled into my trousers, seized my rifle, and prepared to sell my life dearly. Fortunately, Utek and the men arrived back at the camp just as the woman and her crew of furies swept down upon me, and the battle was averted. Somewhat later, when things had quieted down, Utek explained the situation. One of the children had been picking berries when he had seen me go galloping naked across the hills after the wolves. Round-eyed with wonder, he had hastened back to report this phenomenon to his mother. She, brave soul, assumed that I had gone out of my mind. Inuit believe that no white man has very far to go in this direction, and was attempting to assault a pack of wolves barehanded and bare everything else. Calling up the rest of her brood and snatching what weapons were at hand, she had set out at top speed to rescue me. So, again, another instance of misunderstanding turning out to be,
Sure.
just like
it's cute.
Yeah. So anyway, Never Cry Wolf. It's a fun read. I don't know how to put the fictional non-fictional ratio, but if you can just sort of enjoy it and think about some of the more interesting elements of the lessons learned and the way that like humankind is still sort of ultimately, even when we are connected with nature, we are removed from it in certain ways because of the different meaning-making elements that we have.
Sure.
Right? In ways that other animals just haven't developed to the same extent. I would argue they have some versions of those things. Like you see enough, especially group animals, to be like, okay, like there's maybe, if we expand our definition of culture a little bit, there's something going on, right? Ritual behavior and things like that.
Yeah.
And Farley Mowat, yeah, like kind of a all over the place kind of guy. Like
Interesting dude, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, some things about him I really admire, some things about him I really don't, which for a male writer in the 1960s is probably about as good as you can hope for.
I feel like that's about as good as you can hope for with almost anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, true enough.
Yeah.
True enough. But anyway, yeah.
Well, all right. I mean, I thank you for sharing this with me.
My pleasure.
It was worth allowing you to slightly break the formula of my show.
That's
a little
right.
bit,
I realized that after I told you I was going to do it, that I was like, oh wait, it's like kind of in there. And we did get to go on a fun digression about the nature of fiction and nonfiction. Which
Yeah.
I always like.
And winter is coming.
Sure is.
And it seems appropriate as we slide towards the holidays and the most frozen parts of the year. A little wolf digression.
A little wolf digression from the
Go into the great frozen north together.
The actual tundra.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tundra tales.
All right.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me again, Ty. If people would like to find you, where should they look?
They can find me at my website, which is the very creatively named typhelps.com. I have started a Substack called A Beginner's Mindset, and you can find that on that website, where I write about creativity and all kinds of other things. And then I guess I'm on Instagram, but it's private, so you have to request me.
All right. There you have it.
There you have it.
Go find Ty at his website. Go check out his Substack. I am a subscriber. It's very charming. I enjoy it very much.
To be fair, I signed you up unilaterally at the beginning, but thank you for not unsubscribing yet.
You didn't have to tell them that. You could have let them think that
Nope.
I signed up of my own free will.
That's fine. I'm willing to be honest. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's go drink some wolf juice.
Ugh. Gross. Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you all so much for being here with us today. And as always, if you can, this week, this month, this pay period, consider supporting a living author, because they could really use the love. Bye. Didn't Read It was created, written, recorded, and edited by me, Grace Todd. You can follow the show on Instagram or Twitter at Didn't Read It.
Our theme song is Books, written, performed, and recorded by William Albritton.
For sources cited and a full list of episodes, you can visit us at didntreaditpod.com.
If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review. It makes a big difference, and we appreciate it immensely.
If you did not enjoy the show, we are accepting applications for a full-time nemesis at didntreaditpod@gmail.com. Special thanks to Black Iris Social Club in Richmond, Virginia, and to Pescatrio Publishing.